Hi, and welcome to this first episode of Johnny Does .NET. My name is Johnny Hooibergs, and in this series of videos, I will tell you a little bit more about my favorite programming platform, .NET. In this first episode, I will start with the basics of .NET, and I will tell you about all of the terminology that you will need to know to start learning about this .NET platform. If you start looking online for more information about .NET Framework or .NET Platform, you will immediately get redirected to the official Microsoft website called .NET.microsoft.com. On this website, you can see that .NET Framework is a free cross-platform open source development platform for creating your applications, your computer applications. On the left-hand side of this website, you can see that this year, 2022, we are celebrating the 20 years of .NET. The first version of .NET came out all the way back in 2002, which makes today, 2022, the 20-year anniversary of the .NET platform. Now, if you look at the right-hand side and you scroll a little bit down, you can see that you can get started with the .NET platform. Here you will find lots of documentation, information, and tutorials that will help you to learn about .NET. On the right hand side, there's also a download button where you can download multiple versions of the .NET Framework or .NET Platform. So I'm just going to go ahead and click this link. If you have reached the download page for the .NET Framework, you can immediately see that you can actually select your operating system of choice by these buttons in the top of this web page. So you can see we can download the .NET Framework for Windows, for Linux, for macOS, or even for Docker. I will talk about Docker a little bit later in this video series. You can also see that today, the current version of .NET, the latest current version of .NET is .NET 6.0, which is an LTS version, which is a long-term support version. Long-term support means that this version of .NET will be supported for a long term. For a long time, basically. I will also talk a little bit more about that in a later video. You can also see that you can download two different kinds of .NET. You can download the .NET SDK, or you can download the .NET runtime. Of course, when you are starting out with .NET, you really should know what the difference is between what is an SDK and what is the runtime. So, what is the runtime? Well, the .NET runtime or .NET CLR, Common Language Runtime, is actually one of the most important parts of the .NET platform. The .NET runtime is basically an application that you need to install on your computer, on your target computer, where you want to run the applications that you are creating. So this runtime, again, is an application that will make it possible for us to run our applications. So basically, when we are creating application using some kind of programming language, we are not going to transform that into machine code immediately. And so we don't write machine code as humans because that is a little bit too complicated. We did that long way back in the past. We are not doing that anymore today. We are writing programs using higher abstraction programming languages like C#. These programming languages make it quite easy for us to write programs in because they use the English language, which makes it easier for us to be able to read what the application is actually doing. But it will also use an object-oriented style of programming. Object-oriented is, again, a little bit easier for us to work with because we basically live in a world of objects, and objects have properties and objects can interact with each other. And if we use the same concept in our programming languages, it should be much easier for us to create our applications. But again, that kind of programming language does not make it really easy to run our application on a computer system because a computer system needs machine code, and C# or any other programming language is not machine code. So we need another kind of component that will transform our code, our C# code, for example, into that machine code. But of course, when we do something like that, when we create machine code out of our C# code, we actually need to do that for every single platform we want our application to run on. And all these different platforms are different in many ways. For example, you have an Android smartphone, or you have a Windows PC, or you have a Linux PC. All of these hardware, they have different kind of architecture. So we also need to use different kinds of machine code in order to make our applications work. Because of this, a platform like .NET is basically invented, because all of the steps that we need to take to go from our programming language C# to machine code are handled for us. There's actually many other programming platforms that do about the same thing as what the .NET platform will do. Java, for example, is one of those older platforms. And when I say older, I mean Java already exists for a longer time than .NET, and they're doing basically the same thing, or at least .NET does the same thing because Java was first. But yeah, the .NET runtime is the application that actually is going to run our application, and it's going to transform our application into the actual machine code that is necessary to run our application on that specific hardware. And again, Java does the same thing using the Java runtime. Some people call it the Java virtual machine, or JVM, which is basically the same component as the .NET CLR or .NET Common Language runtime. So when I go a little bit back, you basically have your programming language that you're going to use as a developer. In our case, it's going to be C#. Now this C# code will actually be transformed into another language. And that other language is a common language or an intermediate language. And this is also something that you will see often when you're doing .NET development. It's intermediate language. And why does the intermediate language exist? Why doesn't the .NET runtime, for example, interpret the C# code directly? Well, basically because the .NET platform has support for multiple programming languages. C# is only one of them. You can also do Visual Basic .NET, you can also do F#, and there's many more programming languages that support writing applications for the .NET platform. And because of this, we need that common language. We need a language that is common, so that the .NET runtime only needs to know about this common language, and this common language is the intermediate language, and it's quite literal. You can take that quite literally. It's an intermediate language. It sits in between the language that we create, or the language that we use to create our applications, like C#, and then on the bottom there's the machine code. So the intermediate language sits in between those two kind of steps. Now, of course, we need some additional components to make that work. So we have our C# code that needs to be transformed into intermediate language, and we use a compiler for that. So the C# compiler is an application that will transform our C# code into that intermediate language. So we don't need to write that intermediate language by hand, because it looks a little bit more difficult. And then the .NET Common Language runtime will be able to interpret that intermediate language and compile that down to machine code. Machine code specific for the platform we're running our application on. But instead of compiling from intermediate language to the machine code all at once when we start our application, for example, we are going to do that just in time, only just in time. So JIT is also something that you will see quite often when you read about a .NET platform. And again, it's the same for the Java platform. Basically, that intermediate language is going to be compiled down to machine code just in time, which means that if a user is using your application, and when your application starts, we are not going to compile everything at once to machine code. No, we're only going to compile the code that is necessary for that user. So when that user only uses a very small part of your application, only that part of the application will be just in time compiled to machine code, and all of the rest of the application will be ignored because your user actually does not need it at that moment in time. Of course, there's lots of optimizations here. Some code is compiled beforehand, other code is compiled just in time. There's multiple compilations just in time, but I will talk about that much more later in much more detail. So yeah, again, to recap, we have our programming languages, for example, C#, which gets compiled or transformed down into intermediate language by using a compiler. The intermediate language is the data that is stored in a file, and this file can be run by the .NET runtime. So the .NET runtime, again, is an application that is installed and then runs on our target computer that needs to run our software. And it will interpret that intermediate language, and it will just in time compile it down into machine code for that specific platform. So what is the SDK? So the .NET SDK, or Software Development Kit, is actually a collection of tools that we or you as a software developer can use to create .NET applications. So .NET SDK, again, Software Development Kit, that collection of applications you will use to be able to create these .NET applications. So previously I was already talking about the programming language C#, then the C# compiler that compiles your C# code down into intermediate language, the intermediate language that gets interpreted and just in time compiled into machine code by the runtime. That's already a lot of information and already a lot of components. Now, some of these components are part of the runtime, some of these components are part of the SDK. If you think about it logically, the programming language C# is actually only used by developers like us, so people who are creating .NET applications. If a user wants to run your .NET application by using the .NET runtime, it does not need to know about the C# language, because the code that is being run by the runtime is in intermediate language. So we don't have C#, we don't need C# in our runtime. So C# as a programming language is already a component that's part of the SDK and not part of the runtime. Now, another component, the C# compiler, is actually also part of the SDK, because the C# compiler, again, needs to compile C# code into intermediate language. And we don't need that as part of the runtime, because the runtime only needs the intermediate language, which is already compiled by using that C# compiler. So when you look at it again, it's basically the difference between the .NET runtime and .NET SDKs is quite simple. The .NET runtime is used to run .NET applications, and the .NET SDK is used to create .NET applications. So we as a developer, as a software developer, as people who want to create computer programs, we will need the SDK package with all of those tools inside of it to help us build the applications that we need. The .NET runtime is only needed for people who want to run already existing .NET applications that have already been built by other developers. Of course, when you are a developer, you probably want to create .NET applications, but you will also want to run .NET applications. So you need both. You need both the runtime and the SDK. But when you download the SDK, the runtime is already part of that. So you don't need to download those next to each other. You can just use the SDK. But just to recap, if people want to use your application, you want to share your application with people, and those people want to run your application, they will need the runtime, because that runtime is the application that will actually just in time compile your intermediate language into the machine code for that specific computer platform. If you want to build .NET applications, you will need the SDK, or the Software Development Kit. So if we look back at our download page for the .NET Framework or .NET Platform, we can see that distinction again. We can see that you can download the .NET SDK, or Software Development Kit, if you want to build .NET applications, or you can download the .NET Runtime if you only want to run .NET applications. Another term you will see quite often is the .NET BCL, or Base Class Library. So the .NET Base Class Library is one of those things and one of those components within that .NET platform. So the .NET platform is not only a programming language like C# or a C# compiler or a .NET runtime or intermediate language. It's of course much more than that even. Because when we want to create a software application by using a programming language like C#, there already needs to be something that we can use. We don't want to start from scratch. So if we want to create a user interface, for example, we're not going to draw that user interface pixel by pixel. No, we are going to use already existing components, and we're going to mix and match to create something that we'd like based on those existing things. Now, these existing things, they can be part of that .NET base class library. A base class library literally means it's a library, it's a base library of classes, where a class is a blueprint for an object that we need to use or need to create. So again, when we go back to C# as a programming language, there are multiple things that we really need when creating our applications. So for example, an application today can almost never exist without needing to contact a network or the internet, for example. We almost always need to communicate with something else in order to do something useful. So communication with a network or with the internet, all the components to do that are part of that base class library. Another thing that is being used quite often is, for example, file access. When we are needing to access files on a file system for a specific operating system, we also need to do that quite often. We want to create files, we want to write data into files, we want to read data from files, we want to delete a file, for example. All of those things are already part of that base class library, and we can use those objects, we can create instances of those objects, and we can build our applications around that. Also, something very cool in the .NET platform is that the .NET base class library, since a couple of versions of .NET ago, is also open source and available online on the internet. So if you want to look at what is inside of this base class library, what is available, but also how is it coded, what does the code look like, the people who created these components within the .NET base class library, how did they do it? As a programmer and developer myself, I find it very helpful to sometimes look at a function that I'm using quite regularly, to look at the code online. What steps does it take to do the thing that I want it to do, and learn from that. So quite cool that code like that is available online for us to look at. So again, base class library, the .NET base class library is a component within that .NET platform, and it's there for us as a developer to use in our applications, because we don't want to invent the wheel over and over again. No, we are going to use these components that are already created for us, and that are supported by the entire .NET ecosystem. And we're not quite finished. There's also the .NET CLI, or .NET command line interface. So the .NET CLI is actually a part of the .NET SDK, and it helps us developers or programmers to build not only build .NET applications, but also use this tool to do all kinds of helpful things while we are building our .NET applications. There are many tools out there that will make it very easy for us to create new .NET applications, to write code, to debug code, and to build actual working versions of our .NET applications. Tools like Microsoft Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code, or even tools from other vendors. But these tools have their limitations. For example, Microsoft Visual Studio only runs on Windows operating systems or on macOS. There's a different version for macOS, but that's it. So because today the .NET platform actually runs on multiple platforms, it runs on multiple operating systems, multiple hardware architectures, it should be quite helpful if we could do everything we need to do as a developer on the same kind of platforms, and the .NET CLI will actually help us with that. The .NET CLI is a command line tool. It runs in our terminal window or our console window, and we can run commands to do all kinds of different things. And we can create new .NET applications based on templates. We can compile our .NET applications. If we've written them in C#, we can compile them into intermediate language. We can debug. We can run our applications in a debug modus while we are watching what actually is happening. All of this is possible from that one single .NET command line interface tool, which is very cool. Again, when you want to run your application on very exotic hardware that is supported by the .NET platform, you can actually also do part of your development on that same platform thanks to that .NET CLI. Maybe Microsoft Visual Studio is not available on that platform, but the .NET CLI surely is available on that. This was the first episode of Johnny Does .NET, where I gave you an introduction to what the .NET platform is all about. In the next episodes throughout this series, I will dive into much more details about all of these different aspects. I will give you loads of examples and even code examples when doing some .NET. But in the next episode, episode 2, I will first talk to you about the history of the .NET platform, but also the future of the .NET platform. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, give me a thumbs up. And if you'd like to be notified about next episodes, I will be back every week with a new episode, so you can subscribe to be notified of that. So, see you next week.